So I decided to do here, I've already recorded the look at the art of the Renaissance, but actually realizing that this is maybe the part that's most important. Again, Renaissance art per se is not likely to be a part of the AP World History exam, but maybe a little bit of background into what was changing in Europe that would lead to a Renaissance, and then you can look at the Purdy pictures if you want. Not sure if the technology is going to work. Ideally, I'm going to take these 7 or 8 slides, add them to the old one, make a new film, and you can stop at any point that you feel like stopping because it's not a mandatory lecture. Otherwise, it might be a second shorter one. Let's just see what happens trying new technological bounds. First of all, the so-called Middle Ages, also called quite judgmentally the Dark Ages. Really, what we're looking at is the so-called fall of Rome, and again, a date in history that's kind of worth at least having it as a little post hole. You can pound a stake into this date to kind of say here's what happened before and after. Generally stated as 476 CE. Now that's when outside invaders came, burned Rome to the ground, etc. There was no further Roman emperor. Although remember, where is it that the Roman Empire continued to exist? Yeah, in Constantinople. Remember the Eastern Roman Empire, which becomes known as the Byzantine Empire. Obviously different from Rome, didn't include the city of Rome, but they can still consider themselves to be the legacy of Rome, the Roman Empire. Obviously, by 1066, you have a split in churches where they no longer, in the Byzantine Empire, recognize the authority of the Pope, but they would consider themselves, the Byzantines, as the legitimate Roman Empire legacy as opposed to what the church had become in the West. By the way, another question, when Istanbul, Constantinople is conquered by the Ottomans and becomes Istanbul and is no longer the seat of the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire, what becomes the third Rome? And the answer to that is Moscow. Orthodox Christians in Moscow, in the new growing state of Russia, consider themselves to be the new home of true Christianity, which in their case is Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox Christianity, and they begin to refer to themselves as the Third Rome. And really, I guess, about at the time that, you could probably say the Dark Ages start to change in about the 14th century. Remember, it's not an exact date, but what we're really looking at is the Renaissance in Italy, which spreads to the north, the printing press, the modern nation states, basically more order. What you're looking at in Europe is, 800 or 900 years of lack of centralization, lack of order, um, general lack of economic growth and technological growth, etc. But do notice what I say here. It really wasn't totally dark. And we have a tendency, and obviously referring to the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, well, that is a more modern, pre-modern, modern European conception. Wow, after the fall of Rome, we basically did nothing until we have the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. But it isn't that dark. For example, this is the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which was actually nearly destroyed in the fire last year, and big parts of it have been damaged permanently. But have a look at this over on the right. I mean, that's not a dark period. That is an just absolutely unreal technological creation. Obviously, there was a central power. There was scientific and technological and architectural understanding and abilities, etc. So it's not as if Europe literally took a nap for 800 years and then boom, the Renaissance happened. What are the big influences? Well, the church, to be sure, absolutely. I think I've mentioned this in class, but somewhere in the 11th century, the, the an emperor, Henry the, gosh, I can't even recall which, but there was an emperor who said, you know what, I'm really in charge of this area, and why should I have the church tell me who the bishops are? I'll appoint the bishops. Well, the Pope, who was a Pope Gregory, there are like 96 Gregories, Gregory said, oh, no, 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 this is the church's job. And the Emperor Henry said, well, but I'm going to do it. You can't stop me. Well, what did the Pope Gregory do? He excommunicated the emperor, which means he kicked him out of the church. which means, number one, if the emperor is a firm believer, I'm not getting to heaven because I can't do it without the church working with me, providing the sacraments, the holy rituals, number one. And B, if I'm claiming to rule over an entirely Christian population that lives by the word of the church, and the church has kicked me out, man, I'm in big trouble. I can't continue to hold on to power. So what the emperor ends up doing is, and this is true, actually walked across the Alps. It's to a town in northern Italy called Canossa, and this is where the Pope was staying at the time. He didn't spend a lot of his time in Rome, and literally sat outside, as the story goes, in the freezing cold, wearing only rags, sat outside on his knees, begging for the Pope to forgive him. By the way, if we ever talk about a walk to Canossa metaphorically, that means surrendering, giving up, begging for forgiveness, suggesting tremendous weakness. Now, based on that one little story, what would that tell you about the power of the church versus the power of secular rulers? Obviously, the church is absolutely dominant at this point. More locally, feudalism. Now, feudalism it confuses people a little, but it's not actually all that tricky. And I know already we've talked about the Japanese and about the systems of daimyos at the top or the shogun at the top and then the various lords, the daimyos. It's really the same type of thing because there is no central authority. There is no king of France, king of Spain. What you have is landowners, sometimes small, sometimes powerful. What is their goal? More land, more power. The system that sort of develops, and by the way, it's also called manorialism, but feudalism will be just fine for our purposes. Well, the idea is if I control a big chunk of land, of course I'm going to want to get more, but I'm also going to want to keep control of what I have. Now, I could go out there with my sword or other weapons and make everybody do what I say and pay taxes. Realistically, that's not going to happen. So, what I will do is find three of you in this class and say, all right, this is all my land. I'm in charge. However, I'm going to give you three of you control over a third of my land. Now, you owe me. You owe me. If I get attacked by another lord, well, you're going to come and raise soldiers for me, and you're going to be taxing me. But I'm going to be taxing you, but also you're going to have the ability to work this land and have people under you that will pay taxes to you. Really, it's a pyramid scheme if you think about it. And then because that's still a big chunk of land for you, you're going to find three other people to work under you. So they keep control of the population. They raise the food taxes. Normally, it wasn't money from the local serfs and peasants and so forth, which part of which they keep and they pass on the rent next to you, and then you pass on part of what you've collected onto me. Now, why do people engage in this? Well, from the various levels of lords, from the most powerful to the less powerful to the less powerful, well, you get stability, you get a place, you get status, you get the ability to collect some taxes. Now, why am I, the major lord who controls most of this territory, willing to do this? Well, because I'm protecting you. Good for you, but for me, I've also got your back. If I am invaded, let's say by Skeletonia or by Taborgania, the local lords just to the west of me, you folks will have to come and protect me and raise soldiers and so forth. By the way, at the very bottom of this whole scene of feudalism is the vast majority, the 95%, I couldn't tell you an exact number, the serfs, the peasants. And depending upon where you are in Europe, there's not a lot to distinguish the serfs from slaves. In effect, they were tied to the land. They could be bought and sold. They could be moved along. They did not have the freedom to move on by themselves. And so obviously this didn't work out terribly well for the vast majority of European people. That said, though, it did provide a certain degree of order, and we know that order at least can also be life sustaining. The big developments during this period, we do start to see the rise of towns, of cities. Not massive cities. We're not talking, 11 million people like modern day Paris or London, but we are talking about in the many thousands. And this is important because at some point, well, first of all, it provides education, trade, economic growth, but also for a lot of these peasants, a lot of these serfs, it provides them with another place to go. And you're going to see at times in which there is societal breakdown, in particular during the bubonic plague, the Black Death of the 1340s, 50s, you find a lot of serfs and peasants moving to the towns, which allows them a certain degree of freedom. Cities become huge. As you know today, the world is much more urban. Western Europe, the United States, it's almost entirely urban. That happens during this period. And also, you start seeing early nation states start to form. And honestly, just to make it overly simple, what this means is the top feudal lords who controlled a large amount of land, well, gradually they were able to control more and more land and more people until they were able to say, well, I am king. And for the lesser nobles, the lesser lords, well, we may not like calling Ziegler king, but let's acknowledge the power, the military that he has. I guess he is King Ziegler of Zegertonia. And that becomes a nation state which begins to tax more, have more resources, have stronger armies, eventually start funding, especially Spain and Portugal to begin with, expeditions to other parts of the world, which of course starts bringing in the silver and the wealth and the different crops and etc. So this is really the Middle Ages, just to summarize, is not just some passive, nothing happened. Change was slow. It was gradual. It was less orderly. It was less knowledge based than perhaps the height of the Roman Empire and what came after, but it is a significant transition period. By the way, ask yourself, from the 500s, 600s until let's say the 13, 1400s, maybe do some thinking. We can talk about this in class perhaps. What was happening in the world of Islam? Which of course starts in the 600s. What was happening in East Asia, in China, in India, and until this period, the Americas, which are completely cut off from the rest of the world. So again, want to be able to think about what's happening in various areas. Yeah, and here is Europe in 1492. Again, not all that terribly familiar with today's map. I mean, you see various countries on here that are familiar. You are, I think, legitimately seeing a France, a Spain, a Portugal, a United Kingdom. Sweden, I know less about, but Denmark, Sweden, etc. Denmark, of course, is taking over parts of Finland here. There is no Norway. There is a Sweden, Norway, etc. You are starting to see areas in Russia forming, Lithuania, which is a small state today. Probably for our purposes, most importantly, though, is looking at what we call Italy and the Holy Roman Empire. Now, right here, you'd say, oh my goodness, in Italy and Germany and Austria, gosh, there must be 15 or 20 different states. Actually, the real answer is probably thousands of different states. Within what we call Italy today, the boot, the um, geographic definition of Italy, you are seeing dozens and dozens and dozens of independent or partly independent city states. Genoa, Venice, Florence, etc., are just simply run by separate governments. And the so called Holy Roman Empire, which Voltaire famously said, well, it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman because it didn't include Rome, and it was certainly not an empire. You are seeing, 8 or 10 different independent states here. But again, there were hundreds that were loosely affiliated with each other, sometimes, sometimes not. So this is a very different map of Europe than we are seeing today. So here are the four big questions. What was the Renaissance? Why and where was it centered in Italy? Why Italy and not in England or in the Ottoman Empire? And why during this period? Why do we say, nah, the Renaissance, 1300, 1600, oh, I don't think it really starts until later in the 14th century. Well, I think, really with the sack of Rome in 1527, it's over. These are rough dates, but why during this period? Why not 1100 to 1400? Why not 1700 to 2000? And the fourth question is, how do I spell it? Because people misspell the word. Renai. Sance, the double S and the single N. That's where people have trouble. So, what was the Renaissance? A flowering, a blooming of culture, whatever exactly that means, beginning 14th century Italy, choose your date. Notice that Renaissance means rebirth. Rebirth of what? Well, the people at the time saw it as a rebirth of Greco Roman culture. There is a very, very famous statement: if we can see so far in today's world during the Renaissance, it is because we stand on the shoulders of giants. Recall that the Greeks and the Romans man, they had learned a lot. There was a Greek geographer, oh gosh, about almost 2,000 years ago, that never traveled more than a few hundred miles from his home, but he certainly understood. His name was Ptolemy, and he certainly understood that the world was a sphere, that it's not a flat world. Every Greek and Roman scientist just simply understood that. He said, well, I wonder how big this sphere is. And he did a series of experiments and measurements and said, and again, this is 2,000 years ago, said, yeah, I think in modern day language, I think we're talking about 23,800 miles at the equator around. And you know what? The real answer is about 25,000 miles. In other words, 95% accurate, despite really living his whole life between in parts of Egypt, which is where he lived. So these were knowledgeable folks. It started coming back during the so-called Dark Ages. Well, these Romans were pagans, the Greeks didn't believe in Jesus, and we don't have people reading, period, because everything is written in Latin, so the church alone determines everything. Suddenly these ideas are coming back. The scholarship is coming back. Changes in techniques, ideas. In other words, there's a lot of new stuff that the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks never touched. You know, Normally we think the Renaissance, oh, we think it's art, 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 and it is. That's a huge part of it. But also literature and philosophy, politics, the beginnings of a scientific revolution, how people simply behaved. Want to be very clear that most people in 15th century Italy, much less 15th century Europe, were not even remotely affected by this Renaissance. Their lives hadn't changed one bit. Who knows? Maybe they made a pilgrimage to the big city and they saw statues. Wow, that's really realistic. They saw paintings, but it really had no impact. So it was certainly just the elite. And a real important concept: humanism. In other words, a focus on humanities, on people, on the individual. In a way, this seems obvious, except it's not, because the focus of most European scholarship, most European just learning and thinking, what mattered? Well, it was God, it was the Bible, it was the church, it was religion, individual people. Look, we are just here to try to get into heaven, so kind of who cares? One of the phrases that was used commonly during the Renaissance: man is the measure of all things. In other words, what can human beings do? Now, it did not mean that these people were a-religious, that they were atheists. No, most of them were very religious people. I think there are some legitimate questions about Da Vinci. Understand, though, if you were to say in the year, and many others, but I think if you were to say in 1460, I don't believe in God, the church is a fraud, well, you would literally be burned at the stake. So for the most part, we will call this a very religious era, but much more focus on humans and human affairs. And you can certainly argue that that focus has continued, coming back and forth into the Western world in recent years, over the last 500 years. So man is the measure of all things. Man can do as he will. The individual, the artist as the genius, certainly Michelangelo saw that. And again, secularism. Secularism means not focusing your society and your government upon religion. Now, very Christian. Again, you will not find people that were openly non-believers, and most of them certainly were. I mean, almost all were believers, but the focus wasn't only the church. Here's what Italy is. And again, this is a slightly smaller map, or more detailed map. So you'll see that there aren't 8 or 10 different states. Oh, there are really 15 or 20. You know what? There were dozens and dozens and dozens and different relationships between them. The major ones worth knowing, I think Venice, Milan, Naples, Florence, absolutely, absolutely, because that was the heart of the Renaissance. Genoa is where Columbus came from, etc. And the so called papal states. Papal means papa, means pope, centered on the Vatican in Rome. And depending, at first it was a huge expanse of land, and then it became smaller and smaller. Today, Vatican City is an independent construction within Rome, but it's limited to that city. However, of course, even as the church's influence declined, still has a lot of influence over all of quote unquote Italy. Notice the quotation marks up there, and over the rest of Europe, and even in the non Catholic world the church has some major power still today, although nothing compared to the days of the walk to Canossa. And I don't know why that came in last, but it's not a unified nation state. Yeah, Greek style city states, sure, makes sense. So, why during this period? Well, again, the Dark Ages were not so dark. It's not as if there was nothing going on and then all of a sudden this flower of learning. It's not how it worked. The Gothic architecture we have seen. Hey, the major universities, Oxford and Cambridge and I could think of some in Spain, Salamanca in Spain. These all developed in the 12th, 13th century, 14th centuries, etc. So if that kind of learning, that kind of scholarship, certainly within the monasteries, there were incredibly knowledgeable, educated monks. It's not as if nothing happened. And the Crusades. Now, the Crusades did an awful lot of stuff. The Crusades obviously led to conflict between Muslims and Christians to the people at the time. It led to a lot of death. It led to all of this. It also led to the Crusaders coming back from the Muslim world armed with not only foods and dress and technology, but also with learning. And the Muslim world in general, there was debate about this to be sure within the Muslim world, but the general approach that they had toward non-Christian learning, the Greeks and the Romans and the stuff coming from India, the pagans in India, to simplify, the general theme in the Muslim world was, hey, if these people existed, this must be part of God's plan. We understand that Socrates, that Plato, that the great scientists from India were not Christians. Well, of course not. They came before Jesus' time, but it would be wrong for us to ignore this. So, generally speaking, within the Muslim world, and this is part of why the Muslim world was so far advanced compared to Christianity, is that they used this learning. They translated the Greek and the Roman into Arabic, and people used this. Certainly, the great scientists of the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, they weren't Europeans. They were never Europeans. They were Chinese or they were Muslim for the most part, or Indian for the most part. So these ideas come back. You also see that the church starts to lose its authority. You see the major nation states. You know what? We really do have England and France starting to appear. A little bit later, Spain. France undergoes a series of civil wars until almost 1600, but we are starting to see big, powerful nation states. And the bubonic plague, boy, you could spend years thinking about the impact this had. Now it's a worldwide impact. I mean, it's part of what destroyed the Mongol Empire. It was as far as North Africa. Tremendous, tremendous death, destruction of the social order in India and China, and the links across Afro-Eurasia, to be sure. Thinking about Europe particularly, you know what? Different estimates, but within a few years, maybe a quarter to a third of all Europeans died. And there are some areas in which it's 90%. Whole areas are completely wiped out. Well, aside from the human tragedy of it, and we lose that. I mean, people, they loved their family members. They mourned, they felt grief, they felt pain, just like we do today. Think about what this would mean about the political life, the social life. What happens to the Lord who has all of his serfs wiped out? Hey, what happens to the serfs whose lords, whose ruling class has died off or tried to escape? Well, they're kind of on their own. And some of them start moving toward these cities, trying to escape the death and the misery. There is the growth of cities. By the way, when we talk also about the impact of the Crusades, think about this. Not only do you see the Muslim learning and the classical work coming to Europe, But the other thing you see is as these crusaders are pushing through parts of Europe on their way to the Holy Land to liberate from the infidel Muslims, well, they're also traveling. They're going through largely Italy because that was the ports that would get them toward that area. When they showed up, they needed places to stay, and they needed food, and they needed to have their swords refinished. They needed to buy stuff. They needed new clothing. And to meet that demand, you start seeing people moving into the cities to provide for that. The plague increases that even further. The rising centralized governments, either the city-states of Italy or the eventual nation-states, well, they start contributing to these larger growing cities that provides a fertile environment for this Renaissance. And also the GMOH, the great men of history, well, individual people, of course, had a huge impact upon that as well.